Thanks, Angela. Welcome, everybody. I'm Katie Ruckel, the state's Chief Privacy Officer, and today we have Matt King from our office presenting on the report that was required under Senate Bill 5432. That report was centered on cybersecurity, privacy, and data sharing. So today's presentation is going to concentrate on the privacy and data sharing portions of the report. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Matt King. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. As Katie mentioned, for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Matt King. I'm a Privacy and Data Protection Manager within OPDP, and it did seem like Angela's mic was a little hard to understand, so if anybody didn't follow there, I think the important things are that we are recording this and it'll be available later. We'll be sharing the slides after the presentation, and feel free to put any questions you have into the chat along the way. And I'll be planning on stopping around the middle of the presentation, and then hopefully we'll have some time again at the end to get to any of those questions. So as Katie mentioned, we are here to talk about a report that came out of Senate Bill 5432. So if you're here, you're probably familiar with this. It was a bill designed to strengthen cybersecurity efforts in the state. That came about partially because of a large incident, really a series of incidents that affected the state last year, but just in general, the state is conducting more transactions online that used to be done in person. We're accessing the state network from at home on the internet, and we are moving systems over to the cloud. So in general, the threat landscape and our posture has changed, and we need to improve our cybersecurity posture as well. So that led to this bill, which some of the main things that it did include formally creating the Office of Cybersecurity in statute, and then some requirements for that office, including developing a catalog of services, some incident response work, an independent security assessment, and then it also created some new requirements around data sharing agreements in statute. Another thing that it did is it required a best practices report. And here it is from Section 4, that the Office of Cybersecurity, in collaboration with the Office of Privacy and Data Protection and the AGO, shall research and examine existing best practices related to data governance, data protection, and data sharing, including but not limited to terms for data sharing contracts and adherence to privacy principles. So this report was due on December 1st, and it was in fact submitted to the legislature on December 1st. So the materials are available on our website at watech.wa.gov/privacy, and they're also linked here if you want to access the materials from the slide deck once we send that out. So we have the report itself. That includes findings and recommendations related to cybersecurity, privacy, and data sharing agreements. And then we also published a data sharing agreement implementation guidance document together with two different sample DSAs, and I'll talk about those in more detail later on. So for today, we're going to be talking, as Katie mentioned, about privacy best practices, data sharing agreement best practices, and then those supplemental DSA materials that I just mentioned. We're not going to be talking about the cybersecurity findings and recommendations, although you're obviously free to read through those in the report out on the website. And this is always true, but especially today, since we're talking about new laws and legal requirements and contracts, I want to be really clear that what we're presenting today is an informational resource and not intended for the purpose of giving legal advice. So we're going to start with privacy best practices. Obviously, this is a pretty broad topic, and it can be difficult to determine where to start. And so we're actually going to keep it really high level. And in our other presentations, we frequently get down into the details of a specific privacy function or activity that you might do. And we're going to think about it from a broader perspective today, and really think about what are the types of best practices out there that you might be following and using. So we've really broken it up into four categories here: laws and regulations, privacy principles, privacy frameworks, and maturity models that can all work together and lead to effective privacy and data protection. So it's not a strict hierarchy here, and there's not necessarily clear lines between them. There's definitely overlap. But the fact that there's not clear lines between them and that there's overlap also tricks us sometimes into using them interchangeably. And it's helpful to take a step back and think about how they are different, how they can be used differently and together, and to make sure that we're not using them incorrectly. So starting with laws and regulations, I think we know what a privacy law is, but just to be really clear that there are many privacy laws that set baseline requirements for agencies that vary from agency to agency. And again, I think it's pretty clear that when there is a law that applies, we should all be following it. The benefit of developing the privacy program around laws and regulations is mainly that it offers relative certainty and predictability. So there's certainly areas for confusion, there's certainly gray areas, but in general, where we have strict privacy laws, there tends to be some kind of checklist or set of activities, and it's relatively binary that you're either complying with it or not. So while it is helpful to have that kind of certainty and we should comply with laws and regulations, I also just want to highlight that they're not the same as privacy frameworks, which is a frequent mistake. I think people often cite GDPR, especially as a privacy framework. They're not maturity models, and they're not perfect. They're not always detailed enough to actually operationalize. And they're not a guarantee of appropriate practices. So there's a real opportunity for there to be a gap between what a law requires and what we actually should be doing to effectively protect people's personal information. So just a couple of examples of why there might be gaps. Law may not have expectations that actually meet or might not set standards, excuse me, that are strong enough to meet people's actual expectations about how we're going to use their information. So this comes up sometimes when you hear about something like Cambridge Analytica, for example, with Facebook a few years ago, where there was this big debate about whether it was actually a breach or not, because there wasn't a cybersecurity incident. It was just the information was being used in a way that people didn't expect or like. There may also be changes in technology and business practices, and laws don't do a good job of keeping up with those changes. And laws may not account for an organization's specific mission or cultural context. So you very likely, especially all of us as state employees serving the public, that we probably want to set a higher standard than other organizations might. So I think another kind of way that I like to think about this is that when you're talking about compliance with the law, you're inherently talking about risks to the organization. And when you're implementing effective privacy practices, what you really want to be thinking about is risks to people. Next, we're going to go on here to privacy principles, which are the organizational values that underpin privacy practices. So not the specific functions or actual activities, but just the values that drive those functions and activities. So this, or the foundation for privacy principles started almost a half a century ago with the Fair Information Practice Principles. And there have been lots of variations of them over the decades that have been adopted by federal agencies like the FTC and international organizations. And then you definitely see pieces of these principles in privacy laws. They're definitely in HIPAA. You can see it all throughout the GDPR and other laws. But even though the basic concept is settled, there's no single authoritative version of the Fair Information Practice Principles or privacy principles. In Washington State, we have the Washington State Agency Privacy Principles, which you see here, which are data minimization, lawful, fair, and responsible use, purpose limitation, transparency, and accountability, due diligence, individual participation, and security. So we want to use these principles to drive all the other privacy activities that we do. But articulating them alone is not enough for them to really be effective. These are just some of the things that we should be doing. And by we, I mean me and Katie and Zach in the Office of Privacy and Data Protection, but also all of you. So one of them is to talk about them. So I think a real benefit about the privacy principles is that they can be shorthand for some really complicated topics. So if you're talking about the data minimization principle, for example, it's a lot easier to be in a meeting and say, hey, is that consistent with the principle of minimizing data than it is to say, hey, is that consistent with our policy 10.5, right? So it really is a shorthand and a good communication tool. Even though I definitely think that's true, it is also important to adopt formal policies that either explicitly incorporate these kinds of principles or at least contemplate the policies. So in addition to using them to talk about good practices, putting them in policies also adds some formality and some teeth to it. We should be requiring training and doing other types of awareness activities, especially for people who handle personal information, and incorporating these basic concepts and values in those training and awareness activities. We should be promoting workforce development because we need people who understand these principles, that are talking about the principles, and we should be incorporating them in other work that we do. Whether it's frameworks like we'll talk about later, or privacy impact assessments, or really any other privacy program activities. Okay, we're going to switch to privacy frameworks now. So unlike laws, privacy frameworks are not about requirements, although they can be mapped to legal requirements to make sure that you're meeting whatever standards apply to your organization. So what a framework does is it provides the structure and basis to implement privacy practices and operationalize a privacy program. So really those specific functions and activities to have effective privacy controls. And they can be applied in parts. They're not intended to be a one-size-fits-all thing. So depending on the actual types of information that your agency has, your risk profile, your resources, your current level of privacy maturity, you can apply them in part instead of in whole, and really tailor it to your agency. So that flexibility is a key strength of privacy frameworks, but also want to highlight that it can be applied in a way that is too lenient. And if you do that, then it's going to lead to ineffective practices. And it can also be applied in a way that is too conservative, not conservation. So if you apply it in a way that's too conservative, that can lead to inefficient practices. So I'm not going to talk in detail about all the different frameworks out there, but I did want to just briefly highlight the NIST privacy framework to show you an example of what this looks like. So this is called the core of the NIST privacy framework. That includes basically all the activities and outcomes that would enable effective privacy risk management. So it starts with these functions on the left: identify, govern, control, communicate, and protect. And then these get increasingly granular as you move to the right. So the functions are broken into specific categories, and then even more detailed subcategories beyond that. So as one example, under identify, as the function, you would then have a category of inventory and mapping. And then you could have subcategories that would include things like inventorying systems that process data, inventorying the types of people whose information is being collected, inventorying the specific data elements, and inventorying what's being done with that data and why. The whole core and all of these categories and subcategories are sort of like the menu of possible things that you could incorporate in a privacy program. But as I mentioned, you don't have to include all of them, and there are lots of different ways you can use it. So one of them is shown here, where you create two two profiles is what the framework calls them. One being what you already have in place, so that's your current profile, and then a target profile of what are all the things that your organization wants to have in place. What are the things that are important to you and that you want to prioritize? And then you can use those two profiles to do a gap analysis and figure out where to dedicate resources. And you can also use the target profile in procurement and other places where you might want to communicate with people outside your agency about what you want in place to protect your information. And then one last thing on the NIST privacy framework is I did want to highlight too that one benefit of this is it's very likely your agency is already using the NIST cybersecurity framework and different NIST resources. And if that's the case, it really helps when implementing the NIST privacy framework because people are familiar with these concepts. So on the left here in that circle, you have the cybersecurity functions and the privacy functions are on the right. So people are familiar with the way this works with the core and the profiles that I just showed you. And so if you're implementing this framework, you're teaching some new words to people and some new concepts, but you're not necessarily teaching them an entirely new language. And then the last thing on that hierarchy I showed at the beginning was maturity models. So we've already talked about laws, which are what you have to do. We've talked about frameworks, which are what you need or want to do. And so the maturity model is really the next step of how well are you doing those things that you have to do and that you need or want to do. So there are several maturity models out there. You can Google it, privacy maturity models, but this is one of the more prominent ones. It's from the generally accepted privacy principles from the American Institute of CPAs. And so it's based on 73 different criteria and then goes from ad hoc to repeatable, defined, managed, and optimized. And so this is just one example of what this maturity model would look like. And this is the criteria about personal information identification and classification. So I mentioned at the beginning that we're keeping this high level for this conversation and not talking about specific functions and activities, but there are a couple of miscellaneous things that were included in the report and that I just want to briefly highlight here. So on the left, we have things that OPDP should do or continue to do. So one is develop additional training and awareness tools. And we should be tailoring those resources to address the greatest privacy risk. So what is the biggest need for agencies? So I think you've seen that in what we've done over the last couple of years with breach notification, education, data classification, and data sharing agreements, which we're talking about today, are another one of those higher risk areas. We should be incorporating the privacy principles in any new resources to make sure that those are becoming more commonly used. We should be promoting workforce development, which will include, cultivating community of privacy professionals and people interested in privacy like you all to help distribute and share best practices. And then also launch a privacy professionals bootcamp program for people who work on privacy in their agency. And that is something that is underway now. And then we should publish a privacy impact assessment template for major IT projects that involve personal information. So again, that is something that's underway and is already an established best practice in private industry and in the federal government and has been for quite a while. On the agency side, definitely want to continue to see agencies invest in their privacy programs. We've watched the number of agencies that have privacy officers and other staff increase pretty steadily over the last several years, and we want to keep seeing that. And we really want to see privacy contacts at agencies, even if privacy is not that person's full-time job, to make sure that there's somebody on point to get those resources and push them out to their agency. These last two, a lot of agencies have already done this, but if you haven't, making training mandatory for some or all staff, at least those staff who handle personal information as part of their normal duties, is a very important first step. And then also implementing formal privacy policies that incorporate the privacy principles that we talked about. So I'm going to switch over to data sharing agreements, but I will pause here. I don't know if there are any questions that came in or if anyone has anything that's come up. All right. I will power forward. Okay, data sharing agreements. So we have some new data sharing agreement requirements in law. These both came out of ESSB 5432. The first one is in Chapter 3926, which is about procurement of goods and services. And so this is a chapter that applies to state agencies. And this new requirement covers sharing with contractors. So it says before an agency shares with a contractor, category 3 or higher data, then a written data sharing agreement must be in place. The bill included another new section, which is in Chapter 3934 RCW, which is the Interlocal Cooperation Act. And so this is a little broader and applies to all state and local agencies. And so this one, unlike on the last slide where the requirement applies to sharing with contractors, this talks about sharing between agencies. So it says if a public agency is requesting from another public agency category 3 or higher data, then the requesting agency shall provide for a written agreement between the agencies. And then the third one is one that has been in place for quite a while, which is in OCIO Security Standard 141.10, which says when sharing category 3 and above data outside the agency, an agreement must be in place unless otherwise prescribed by law. So getting DSAs in place is certainly important when it's something that's required, but it's also just a good practice, even if none of those requirements existed. These are just some of the key benefits. First one, to document all your data flows. Do you know where all your information is located and who has access to it? So I think when we talk about, do you know where your data is? People are often talking about the types of data that their agency maintains and where is it within the agency. But what about those third parties and all the other places it's stored? They help ensure appropriate protections to prevent incidents and misuse. So they're the key way that you can pass down security requirements and data handling requirements and the appropriate uses for information. So you have very likely a set of policies that apply to how your agency, how staff at your agency handle information. So DSAs help you pass those through to other third parties. They help outline responsibilities and mitigate impacts in the event that an incident does occur, to make sure that you're not left flat-footed, you know who's responsible for taking action, and there's a plan to do that. And then they create a natural gate to help vet data sharing relationships. So it's a mechanism to vet against privacy principles, ensure the minimum amount of information is being shared, that uses are appropriately limited, and that the sharing is responsible and fair. So by having this checkpoint there, it's really a mechanism to make sure that there's some visibility into where data is going and accountability for those decisions. There are a lot of agencies that have been doing a really good job at this for a long time. We asked about it, especially in light of the new requirements in our annual privacy assessment survey, and agencies definitely indicated they were paying more attention to it again, and that they've taken a lot of steps to comply, that they are reviewing and modifying existing DSA language, creating new administrative controls, and entering new agreements to memorialize existing data sharing relationships that didn't have a contract associated with them. The agencies also indicated that they're having some timing constraints. There was a very quick turnaround in the new law. It was passed in the spring and effective in July. Concerns about insufficient staffing to execute all these DSAs, that they were having problems because they didn't have existing controls already in place to have some oversight and approval process for these data sharing agreements, and that there was a need for additional education and training for staff. So for the rest of the presentation, we're going to talk about some concepts to keep in mind as we all keep tackling this work, and also some resources that are now available to help. So I'm sure we could have listed out a lot more than 4 things here, but basically just broken this down into understanding data classification, identifying when an agreement is needed, executing appropriate agreements, and monitoring. We've presented on data classification before, so I'm just going to really briefly point out why this is important. So all 3 of those requirements for DSAs attach when you're sharing category 3 or 4 information. So you need to be able to identify when you have category 3 or 4 information. And again, the basic distinction there is category 3 and 4 is information that is not subject to public disclosure. And category 1 and 2 is information that either you intend to make public or that would be subject to public disclosure if asked for it. And we did, as I mentioned, we did provide a prior presentation on this that's available on our website on the Government Agency Resources page. The next step is going to be identifying when you need a data sharing agreement, which I think the first place to start with that, and the first thing to think about, is what do we mean by data sharing? It's easy to get caught up and try to, tailor some narrow definition of what this means, and different examples of what data sharing is. And I think it's helpful to just keep it really simple, that data sharing is making data available to third parties. So that includes lots of different things, right? So in terms of types of sharing, it includes data transmissions, which I think is the way that most people have traditionally thought about what a data sharing relationship is, where you're creating a data product and you're sending that extract, via email or through SFT. But I'd really encourage people to think about it broader than that, to also include data hosting, where you have vendors that now have access to your data. And system access is also another key way that third parties get access to agency information that has not always been thought of as data sharing. And so in addition to the types of sharing, this is also going to include a lot of routine functions. So it's not just, those one-off extracts with a researcher or those types of things. It's also data sharing that you do to perform the core functions of your agencies, including sharing with contractors and service providers and amongst each other with other public agencies. So these are some of the controls to think about to effectively be able to actually capture all of those ways that data is being shared and identify all those instances where you need a DSA. So the first one's really what we just talked about. Consider all the ways third parties access information. Don't limit it to just those instances where you're sharing a data extract. Log and track data sent outside of systems. So have some type of inventory of those transmissions, which again is a good practice for lots of reasons, not just for data sharing agreements. But if you do have that kind of log, then you can use it to do an audit or a check against data sharing agreements that you have in place and identify gaps. You should build safeguards into existing processes. So we all have a contracts process at our agency. So if there's a template that goes along with that, put a question, does this arrangement involve data sharing? And if it does, then it should trigger entering a data sharing agreement. Another possible process is data product development. If there's some type of ticketing process when new extracts are being created, that would be another good time to ask if there's a data sharing agreement in place. And I think that that one's important too, because data sharing isn't always tied to an existing contract, right? There could be lots of instances where you're sharing data, but there's no money passing, or just the nature of the relationship means that there isn't otherwise a contract. So don't limit yourself just to looking at those existing contracts and seeing if there's data sharing involved with it. Another control is to create common intake tools. So something like a data request form to gather information about what information is going to be shared and why, which then ties into the next bullet about approval requirements. So it gives you the information to determine whether it is appropriate to share. So the level of approval required for a different agency is going to vary a lot from agency to agency, and what's appropriate will vary based on resources and types of information and the risks to that agency. But in general, it could range from designating or allowing all staff to make data sharing relationships, but based on some kind of established criteria, to only certain staff being allowed to authorize data sharing, like data stewards or appointing authorities, to at the other end of the spectrum, full or approval by some type of centralized committee. So the first option of allowing anybody to make decisions based on criteria is certainly scalable and allows flexibility, but it's also likely to lead to inappropriate sharing. And then on the other end, where everything goes through a committee, that creates a lot of accountability and consistency, but the trade-off is it obviously also requires really strong governance processes and a lot of resources to implement. And then the last thing is just policies to require data sharing agreements. So that's kind of like the policies and processes to incorporate everything else above it to make sure that that's formalized and people understand their obligations. And it's not just something that's in the head of you as a privacy professional or security professional. The next thing to think about is actually implementing DSAs once you've identified all the situations where you need them. And the first basic question here is, what is a data sharing agreement? So it's not defined in statute or in OCIO policy, but we have received questions about or from people who are concerned about things like, well, we have an agreement that has data sharing terms in it, but it's not called a data sharing agreement, or we have data sharing terms and they're part of some larger contract. They're not a standalone agreement. So I would encourage you to not get hung up on that and focus on the actual language included, and not whether it's a separate document and not whether it's called a data sharing agreement. The important thing is that you're appropriately documenting what's being shared and why and how it's going to be protected. The next consideration here is that when you're implementing these, you really do have to be flexible. I know that there is a desire to have one set of model terms that everybody can just execute and be done with this, but there really isn't one single version of model terms that would be appropriate for all circumstances and appropriately protect the state. So just some of the reasons here that you might want to consider: the number of parties is going to vary. You may have certainly one-to-one sharing, but there could also be arrangements where there are lots of agencies sharing with each other. The direction of sharing, it could be one direction or it could be sharing back and forth. The relationship between the parties varies a lot. Sharing with a vendor versus sharing with a federal counterpart versus another agency performing services alongside you are all different relationships that probably warrant different types of contracts. The method of sharing. So how is, again, getting back to the idea that data sharing is broad. Is it system access? Is it sending data transmissions? Is it something else? The purpose of sharing. So you may be using, or in some instances where you're sharing data, like with a researcher, they're doing or they're specifically accessing the information to do something with it. Or when they're a contractor performing a function on your behalf, they're doing it on behalf of the agency. But if they're just hosting whatever data you provide without looking at it or particularly caring what the information is, then that's probably going to warrant some different types of terms. The frequency of sharing, how is this ongoing? Is it one time? Is it at set intervals? And then the last one that I have here is just scope. So again, is it a definable extract or is it broad access to agency information? So all these things mean that we have to be flexible when we're entering DSAs, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't care about it or that we should be so broad that we're no longer protecting our information. So we should only be exercising flexibility for appropriate terms. So one example would be a relationship with an IT vendor who has broad access to information. That likely warrants flexibility about the data description, but that's not going to warrant flexibility around security requirements. We probably want those to be quite strong in that scenario. And I also encourage you to not find the use case that requires the most general terms and then create a generic DSA and use that for all relationships. You still need to apply some rigor here and have specificity whenever possible and appropriate to make sure you're protecting your information. I talked a bit, or I mentioned at least, the idea of what are those specific terms that should go into a DSA. So these are the 9 terms that are currently in OCIO 14110 that a DSA should contemplate. So those are there for people to look at, but I'm going to skip forward to a different list that expanded on this that was developed as part of the report writing process for this report we just submitted. And so it instead includes 13 types of terms that a DSA should typically include, and then another 7 that it might include depending on the circumstances. So purpose and specific authority, why are you sharing it and what is your authority to do so? Sometimes people are confused about what does it mean to list specific authority, especially if it's like with a contractor and you're just performing your core functions. And I think in that instance, the authority is that you're exactly that you are authorized to perform this function and you're sharing it in order to do that. You should be describing the data, including the data classification level. Describe the appropriate uses of the information, which is also frequently going to include things that you want to specifically prohibit. The authorized users or classes of users, if you can't list specific people. Again, there are some circumstances where you, like for system access, as an example, where very often you can list the specific names or specific positions or limit the number of people who can have access. And in other cases, you're going to want that to be more general. Protection of the data in transit if the arrangement involves transmission. So how is the information going to be transmitted and secured while it's being transmitted? Secure storage for data that's maintained outside the agency. So once it's gone, what protections apply to it? Data disposal. So what happens when the information is no longer needed or the contract's in or a contract ends, and what are the responsibilities for how that's returned or destroyed, and how do you verify that that's happened? Backup requirements, if applicable. So this is going to be applicable normally when the sharing involves the third party maintaining the system of record, and then you want to make sure that you have the backup requirements for that data in case it's lost. Incident notification and response. You want to be really sure that you have the processes and responsibilities laid out in contract to require very quick notification to the agency if something happens, and then also outline who's responsible for what, who gets to determine whether an incident actually was a breach or not, who does the reporting, who makes media releases, who pays for all of those things. So you want to think about those things ahead of time before an incident occurs. Monitoring and enforcement. So there's a broad range of controls you could have here. You know, ranging from self-certifications to actual audits and penalties. Awareness and or training. So do you want the people who are going to be accessing the information to sign NDAs, or do they need to take some type of generic privacy training, or do you actually want them to take very specific training for your information because it's so sensitive? Compliance with additional OCIO security requirements. So this is just a catch-all in case there are other things based on what the contractor is doing for you that would make it appropriate to carry forward other OCIO security standards. And then the last one, any other requirements imposed by law, regulation, contract, or policy. What we're really getting at here is that this is just a basic list that's going to be pretty broadly applicable, but there are other circumstances where you want a lot more detailed things. So a good example is in HIPAA, there's a very specific list of things that need to be in contract with contractors called business associates. And so you want to make sure that you're contemplating all those other types of requirements as well. And then the 7 things that you might include in a data sharing agreement. So term and termination, obviously this is going to be in pretty much every contract, but I do think it's particularly important for a data sharing agreement because when that contract is terminated, that's often going to be something that triggers disposing of the data. And termination is also likely going to be, or you should consider it as an enforcement control if something inappropriate is done with your information. An offshore prohibition, we don't have an overarching prohibition on sending personal information outside of the United States, but you may want to consider doing that. Cyber liability insurance in the event that something does happen. Indemnification to protect your agency if something does happen. Third-party requests are something that I think is pretty unique to state agencies that you wouldn't necessarily see in industry DSAs. But what I'm really talking about there is, especially when you're sharing between agencies, what happens when one of you receives a public records request or a subpoena, and how do you handle that and notify the other agency, and who decides whether redactions are made? You may want to consider restrictions on disclosure or publication. So if you know that the person receiving the information is going to do some analysis or publish something about it, do you want the opportunity to review or approve that? And then again, just a catch-all for other widely applicable contract terms. So one of the other resources that we published is data sharing agreement implementation guidance, which is out on our website now. And we're not going to walk through all of the document because we don't have nearly enough time, but I do want to just give you a high-level overview of what is in the document and how you can use it. So again, apologize for the extremely small font here. But so what's in this document is all those terms that we just walked through are the things that should be included in a DSA or might be included, together with kind of a general description of why you may or may not include that, and then sample terms that you may want to consider using to contemplate that term. So on the left here, we have should include authorized uses. And so the different types of terms here, there's one on a general limitation on permitted uses, a general limitation on permitted uses that may be appropriate when the third party is not a vendor, a general limitation on permitted uses when the third party is a vendor, a prohibition on commercial or personal use, a prohibition on linking to other data, a term to allow other or linking to other data in specific circumstances, and a prohibition on data modifications. And that one would be particularly appropriate if it involves system access. And then on the right, there's just a simpler one around offshore prohibition. So give some guidance around why you may want to consider including those terms, and then an example of what that language would actually look like. So there's a pretty big variation in how much detail is provided for each term. And so when you're using this, one thing to keep in mind is that for each type of term, like we saw with authorized uses, there may be multiple appropriate terms. So you don't just want to look at one that, or you're not just looking for one from each section, and maybe that there are several that apply, or in some circumstances, it could be that there are none. You should be prepared to add content and narrative. So as I've mentioned a couple of times, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach here. And even though we hope that this guidance is helpful, it can't all be done without a little bit of manual editing and tailoring to individual uses. Another thing to keep in mind is that some of these terms overlap. So even though they're separate concepts and we broke it out into 13 things that should be included, it's totally possible that one contract clause could cover quite a few different concepts, and that's fine. And then the last two things, I already mentioned this a couple of slides ago, that you should only exercise flexibility when appropriate for the specific relationship, but you should be more specific when you can. And you should also only exercise flexibility when appropriate for the specific terms. So just because there's a good reason for one part of an agreement to be general doesn't mean the entire agreement should be general. The last two resources that are out there now are sample DSAs. So there's just two examples, but they're designed to be usable in a broad range of circumstances. So the first one is an agreement for system access, or and then has alternative language for a predefined extract. And so this is a sample that's more appropriate for when there's a lot of specificity possible. And it contemplates sharing multiple types of information with one party. So the way it works is that the general requirements are laid out in the DSA, and then there can be new exhibits for each data sharing arrangement added to that. So you don't have to modify the underlying DSA every time a new file is sent. Is someone? Okay. And it also includes a sample data disposal certification document, which isn't unique to this contract, but you're certainly willing to take a look at that too. I think somebody maybe isn't on mute. If you could check to make sure that everyone's on mute right now. Thanks. And then the second DSA is a broader one that's more of an overarching agreement that would be appropriate for a multi-party relationship. So this is something that you might want to look to for ideas when there are multiple parties sharing with each other, or the nature of the relationship makes it really hard to have too much specificity in there. And so even though this DSA is intended to be used in broader circumstances, you still want to make sure you're at least including the purpose, authority, and the types of information shared with as much detail as possible. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is monitoring DSAs. So identifying when you need them and implementing them are obviously important, but you need to also monitor them after they're in place. So the first thing on here is to have some type of DSA inventory. So I know I said that you do not need to have a standalone data sharing agreement or to call it a data sharing agreement, but you should really think about what you can do to be able to have a full catalog of all those DSAs. When you have those terms that are buried in another agreement, or you have a data sharing agreement that's not called a data sharing agreement, think about ways that that can be tagged or stored somewhere so you have visibility into it. You want to make sure you have responsibility assigned to monitor the DSA. So I guess that includes sort of proactive actual contract monitoring, but also that there should be people involved in the process who understand the data and how it can be used and should be used and prohibited uses, that you don't want all of this responsibility designated just to, as an example, a contracts assistant who doesn't understand the data involved. or the business using for collecting it and sharing it. You want to contemplate the compliance measurement. So, this is something that you need to think about before you enter the DSA, but you're going to actually do it after the fact. And so we talked about things like audits and self-certifications. And those are all good things to put in contract, but think about what your ability to actually enforce it is going to be. If you put a requirement that says you're going to audit, or the third parties are going to submit audit results or self-certifications, do you have somebody and do you have the capacity to actually look at those and act on them, or even to make sure that they're being submitted? And if you don't, then you may want to think about whether you should be requiring it in the first place, because you could be worse off gathering those, and if there's a deficiency and you're not able to actually act on it. And then the last thing here is to certify disposal. So again, I think this is an area where I've certainly seen a lot of contracts that have good disposal language requiring data to be destroyed or returned when it's no longer needed or the contract ends, but not a lot of follow through when the contract actually ends to make sure that it actually happens. So this ties back to the idea of assigning responsibility and making sure that somebody has the clear authority and responsibility to make sure that happens.